Well, hello. Thank you very much indeed, Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to be joining you today. To follow Chief Moomin is a tough ask, but thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today as we wrap what are an extraordinary couple of days. The Rewired Global Education Summit has brought together some of the world's most influential thinkers on education for the first time since the pandemic. And that is remarkable in and of itself, to see this many people here together talking about what is, or has to be, the most important subject of our generation as we consider how to rethink the way that we teach our kids in the 21st century. We heard from Tarek El-Gerg, the chief executive of Dubai Cares, who framed it thus, and I paraphrase you here, sir. We need a new approach to education. The system we have today is the same system that was set more than 100 years ago. So, how do we create a system that is fit for purpose? Well, there is, or are, nobody better placed to consider that question and help chart a path forward than my three esteemed guests today, who have launched their joint report, The State of the Global Education Crisis, A Path to Recovery. Rob Jenkins is Director of Education for UNICEF, so if you would like to join me, please, on the stage. Stefania Giannini is the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, and Jaime Saavedra is Lead on Education Global Practice at the World Bank. If you would like to join me, please, on the stage for this next panel. Wherever you like. Thank you. Jaime, come and join me here. And Jaime, I want to start with you. This joint report, I've read it. It's fantastic. What I want to know, as we launch this, 25 minutes of discussion here, is I want to start with the key drivers from that report, if you will. Then we're going to talk about how we finance the path forward. But let's start with the key takeaways, if you will.
Thank you very much, Becky. This joint report that we worked with the teams of Rob, Stefania, and the World Bank is trying to a certain extent, is reporting while the fire in the building is still blazing. Unfortunately, the crisis is not over. And we're living, as was said, the worst crisis in education of the last 100 years. Unfortunately, we see that the impact of the very long school closures that we have seen in many countries, that in the case of South Asia or Latin America, it's more than 1.5 years of kids out of school, kids and young people. It's generating a huge shock in their human capital accumulation process. And to give two figures, one is something that was mentioned a few minutes ago. If we see the percentage of children who at age 10 cannot read and understand a text, what we call learning poverty. That learning poverty should be zero. Or kids should be able to read and understand a text at the end of primary. Unfortunately, that number was 53% before the crisis. Our simulations show that that number could rise to 70%. That's a simulation. So that will happen and unless we do something bold and aggressive. However, unfortunately, we have some data already for a few countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, the state of Karnataka, for Mexico, that corroborates those learning losses. And that lower potential, lower productivity of these children in the future might imply that this generation might lose in the future about $14 trillion. That's equivalent to $25,000 per person, per student. And we're not talking here about the loss of the economies. We're talking about the loss of this generation. So our collective worry here is not only the impact in general of the crisis, is the inequality impact. The inequality across generations, so the hit on this generation compares to the previous one or the next one. And also is that this impact has not been homogeneous, right? It has been impacted more the poor, who has been less able to have any type of remedial education, and more the young kids, right, who has been much more difficult for them to engage in the educational process. So actually, we really need to move really fast, right? Not only as international institutions, but as education communities, and countries have to internalize the need of very strong learning recovery packages, right, that try to reduce that potential permanent scar on our generation, on this generation.
Thank you. You talk about the packages that are needed. Your esteemed colleague from the World Bank just pointed out that the education budget within so many of these recovery budgets is, quite frankly, pitifully low. It's something like 3%. So before we come to the work that UNICEF and UNESCO are also doing in conjunction with the World Bank, Jaime, if you will, how can international financial institutions work closely with governments to ensure that these financing gaps are closed, particularly when we see these new variants doing the rounds? And quite frankly, we risk further closures. We don't know whether there will be further closures down the road.
So we don't know, but we need to be prepared. And unfortunately, of the economic recovery packages that we have seen already, only 3% of those resources have gone to education. So actually, it's a combination. It's both stronger support of the international organizations, but that will never be enough, right? It is extremely important that countries, in terms of domestic resource mobilization, understand and internalize the magnitude of this crisis, and that this will just not go away by itself. It's not a matter of, okay, the kids will just return back to school. No, it will require learning packages, right? Learning recovery packages that might cost resources. Now, the menu of policies exists. Countries can streamline their curriculum and prioritize foundational learning and social-emotional support to kids, can extend the school days or the school year. They need to make much more effective the teaching and learning process. But actually, the critical constraint is not only to choose among that menu of policies and put the financial resources, but it's to have the political will of recognizing the magnitude of the crisis and act upon that.
Robert, how can we ensure that all teachers are supported, all teachers are prepared for remedial education, for mental health, for psychosocial support, remote learning to address children's socio-emotional losses throughout their education recovery? This isn't just about ensuring that our kind of classic teaching infrastructure is supported coming out of this pandemic, is it? It's so much deeper than that.
It is so much deeper than that, and thanks, Becky, for raising it. I just want to build also on, Jaime touched on a few of those points, but let me pick up on that important issue of mental health and psycho. I think we all recognize the challenging time that children have been through in the last 20 months. Just as a data point, UNICEF with Gallup did do a large-scale survey globally. It concluded that 1 in 5 16 to 24-year-olds are frequently or very frequently having very depressed thoughts, just as an example. Unfortunately, only 60% of school systems supported teachers with psychosocial or mental health in order to provide that support to children as they return to learning. So there is a gap, we have a crisis, more has to be done. So what are those more things that need to be done? I do want to just flag, school systems need to open or need to stay open. To today, we still have over 700 million children not fully back in schools, either schools fully closed or partially closed. So schools, and now we're having new challenges, as we all know, new viruses, etc. But the risk for children to be out of school is far greater than in school. Schools need to open. As children come back into school, they need to be caught where they are with their learning. And back to Jaime's point, accelerate and provide sufficient support, and teachers will be at the center of that, but also this comprehensive support with psychosocial and mental health and nutritional support, because they've missed out in midday meals, a very important partnership with the World Food Program and ourselves. But water and sanitation. Children cannot be successful with learning if their other key needs are not met. And plus, learning can help them meet their other needs. So it's a very symbiotic relationship, if you'd like. But lastly, as Jaime mentioned, the disparities or the growing marginalization. We need to proactively reach those children that may not have been reached before COVID-19, but particularly now have been disproportionately impacted. So proactively opening up the school doors very, very wide, bridging marginalized children back.
And Stefania, revamping curricula. Revamping education systems. We are in such an opportunistic period here when we think positively about how we're coming out of the pandemic. We've learned so much over the last 3 years. So how can governments and education stakeholders revamp these curricula and these education systems to accelerate the journey of tomorrow's innovators, our kids, tomorrow, in an inclusive and sustainable way? And I use those words on purpose, in an inclusive and sustainable fashion.
Well, I wish to start from an inspiring statement that the Minister of International Cooperation of the UAE yesterday made on this stage. We are here to push the reverse button. And I think that the work that the three organizations are doing, World Bank, UNESCO, and UNICEF, since the beginning of this crisis, this is a very new approach to international cooperation I wish to highlight under the auspices of the Global Partnership for Education, which allow us to establish a consortium to monitor the evolution of the crisis. Since the beginning, we started to collect data. I mean, my colleague said already, given a great picture, maybe just one number I have in mind. Today, while we are talking here, 700 million students and children are still out of school because of the pandemic, for partial or full closure. So we are not out, we are not over. Having said that, rewiring the system, pushing the reverse button means what? Resilience, collaboration, and transformation. And this goes through new kind of competencies and skills that children need today to be global green citizens tomorrow. That means what we call in this century, oh no, maybe in the last century and the beginning of this century still, soft skills should become the hardware of learning and teaching. That means that what in our a bit technical language of people who are obsessed by education, 4.7, the target of SDG 4, education for sustainable development and global citizenship, should become the very core of the new curriculum, an agile curriculum, which not by me, how can I say, focusing on exclusively transmission of knowledge and content discipline by discipline, as we are used today to do in the last century, but to really address the main challenges of the current times: climate change, democracies, and distrust under threat, distrust for public institutions, racism coming out more than ever, hate speech. All these dimensions should be addressed in and through education. So I would say an agile curriculum is the response about the content. Then the second point, if you allow me, just we conclude an interesting discussion because before His Royal Highness came into the room, digital skills. Listen, digital skills are not anymore how can I say, a nice add to have. Digital skills is the universal language we have to learn in this century. Without them, It's not only about children, it's also my generation. You know, in Europe, there is an interesting survey by the European Commission. 60% of people in their 60s are illiterate in terms of digital skills. So the digital skills today are the passport for being an active citizen. You cannot travel. You cannot have access to your health and data about the main components of your life. So schools and education systems for children and students and adults as well should adapt to that. And in this report, we also move from the diagnosis to the therapy. We also give recommendations and solutions to get.
Well, let's talk about that therapy. Thank you. What should the future investment model in education look like, with countries now focusing on recovery? And what are the key lessons learned, sir?
Mm-hmm. So let me mention 3 lessons, but actually with the objective of moving towards an education that actually captures what Stefania has just mentioned. Not only the issue of digital skills, but more important, the issue that you need to create global citizens. But remember that we need to do this in a context in which there are many, many children, millions of children, that today do not have even the fundamental skills. So we need to put that in that context. So let me mention 3 things. The first one is that there was a digital divide, and we need to close the digital divide. Technology has the potential to be the great equalizer, because really technology can allow us to reach all teachers, can allow us to reach all students. Unfortunately, as of today, technology is a great unequalizer. And that's what this pandemic has shown. Actually, this pandemic has shown that some kids were able to recover some learning because of their access to internet, while others were absolutely left out. So that's one lesson that we need to solve. But second lesson is that we have also seen that education is intensive in human interaction, right? If we want to get those skills, right, that are about, let's have that right discussion about racism, about discrimination, right, about all the social values that we want for their kids. Okay, that's not technology, that's a human. Right? It's that teacher that has to be the coach, the person that inspires creativity, teamwork, perseverance. So hence, the future is going to be about that balance between the human factor and technology. Technology is fantastic as a support, as to make more impactful the work of that human factor, the work of that teacher. And let me close with a third lesson, which I think many, many people that are in this room have lived, is that parents and caregivers are protagonists of the education of their children, like it or not. And some are very conscious of that, but others not. And public policy has to take that into account. And public policy has to be also about supporting parents such that they can support the education process of their children. So it's those 3 things, right? Let's do the right thing in terms of the smart investments in technology. Let's always think about education as something intensive in human interaction with technology helping. And third is parents and communities, right, as critical elements of the education process.
Stefania, we know that evidence can drive change and that it's hard to change what you can't measure. Recovery and rewiring education for the future requires more and better data. There is absolutely no doubt about that, and you talk about that in this great report of yours. How can global stakeholders put in place a system to generate timely and reliable data to improve learning?
Thanks for this question, as I'm a bit obsessed by data, I would say. I mean, we know information is power, data is a basic human right now. And we have to, in order to have, to improve policies, we must base this policy on quality data. education is a complex architecture internationally, and we have gaps there. We have more gaps at national level because it's not easy to establish a dashboard in national ministries in order to report about the benchmarks and the targets of SDG 4. SDG 4 is like our roadmap, quality, inclusive education for all by the end of 2030. I mean, the work we are doing together, just launch a learning data compact, is very much focusing on that. It's about calling governments to prioritize this dimension in their policies and to invest. And this is another interesting part of the discussion. Investment on data must come also from other stakeholders, which are very much involved in the collective efforts of boosting a new model of education. Private sector, for instance. We are thinking of a global data observatory, which can revitalize and also valorize two main pillars of the data international collection for education, the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, as well as the GEM report. But let me say about this, we must be a bit more ambitious. Statistics are not enough anymore. We need big data to understand, for instance, the impact on social-emotional learning, to understand the impact on family and parents being on the same side of teachers because of the disruption of the crisis. So I see investment on data as a critical component of the new roadmap for SDG 4. And I think that this alliance, this strong interagency partnership focusing on that point can really become a big game changer. And of course, countries' ownership. We have an excellent cooperation with many countries. I think that this is a dimension that capacity building on data can be developed in the coming months and years.
We have got a couple of minutes, Rob. I think this may be our closing question. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So I'm going to leave this to you. I mean, speaking on behalf of the joint effort here, as it were, what are your key recommendations for our audience, particularly our government partners here at Rewired, who will go back, I hope, I know, to their countries with a sort of renewed energy and will work on transforming their own education systems. What are the key recommendations, if you will?
Well, I'm glad you brought up partnerships. I think in the end, and I actually just want to acknowledge, we've got President Kikete here, the chairperson of the Global Partnership for Education. Tariq, of course, of Dubai Cares, the Minister of Education from Bangladesh, just right here in the front row. We have just such amazing commitment and capacity in the room, as we all fly back. How do we hold on to that partnership and now move forward at an incredibly fast pace, as Jaime said? I feel like we're in a race, and actually Jaime mentioned the word race. We're in a running race, but it's between all of us working collectively with the learning crisis, the skills gap that youth are facing and the challenges they faced. We're in this race. I think it's fair to say right now we're behind, the crisis is in front. But I think it is a marathon, and one mistake you can make in a marathon is going out too fast. So we can make up and accelerate by working together. And those who work together do travel farther. So some nitty-gritty points. We know all these amazing tools, many of the innovative tools that were presented over the last 3 days. I think the key now is how do we take those innovations and make them transformative? And that means at scale. And the report talks about scale, and it talks about speed and scale, recognizing indeed the scale of this crisis. We've heard all these figures, 1.6 billion children affected at the time, 750 million children still currently out of school, 780 million youth not having the skills to participate. These are humongous numbers, so we need big responses. Back to partnership and speed. The last thing is, I think, an overwhelming importance, building a little on what Stefania mentioned on measuring this change and holding ourselves accountable to that change. I think we've got to now translate all that we've been doing collectively and follow the actual youth and child. Now, back to just to wrap up my metaphor on the marathon, at that kind of 14th, 15th mile, if your miles are 30th kilometer running the race, when you're just desperately to stop because it's just too far, it comes down to resilience and sort of guts and will. The great news is the key partner in all this are the youth themselves. And the youth themselves have enormous resilience and enormous drive. And we've seen it in this conference, the youth that have come, but those of us who have the privilege to interact with youth in challenging, marginalized situations see the incredible drive and the incredible resilience. So I'm very optimistic, I know the three of us are, to take us to the next level, following that amazing resilience and strength and will for change by youth themselves. And thanks again, Becky, for having us.
Well, a note of optimism to close out a wonderfully engaging and informative session. Thank you very much indeed. Representatives from UNICEF, from UNESCO, and indeed from the World Bank. Thank you. And that just leaves me the great honor of introducing Her Excellency Reem Al-Hashimi, who is the Minister of State for International Cooperation and Director General of Expo 2020 Dubai, to close this summit.